So we did platelets. We got didn't quite get to the last part. So we spend too much time talking about blood type and babies.
Yeah, the blood type threw us through.
So let's go ahead and finish up our blood clotting so we can get to the fun heart. So if you remember, there was 3 stages of hemostasis, of like preventing blood from leaking out of your vessels. What was the first one? It starts with, so vascular spasm, which is the blood vessel closes up a little bit. What was the second stage? So second is platelet plug. That's the ones we already talked about. Third one is clotting, which we didn't get to. That's kind of where we're at. So one of the cool things about how blood clotting works is basically your blood's full of all these clotting factors, but they're not activated. They're just kind of floating around. Just like you've got platelets floating around all over. The reason they do it that way is so whenever some vessel is damaged, that means you've got what you need to fix it right there, because it's everywhere the blood is. That's a lot faster and more efficient than waiting for the damage to happen and sending a signal somewhere, like to an organ, and the organ has to make something to send it there. That would take way too long, bleed too much. So instead, you send everything around in an inactive form, and then it can get activated when it's needed. So all the clotting factors are like proteins, enzymes, and they've got little Roman numerals behind them, like factor 8, factor 12, factor 7. And unfortunately, you would think maybe they'd act in order, like factor 1 gets activated and then factor 2. But that would be too logical. So instead, how do you think they numbered them? How does that always work in science?
In order of how they were discovered?
Yeah, in order of how they were discovered, of course. And once it gets a name, you can't change it, right? Because then everybody would be really confused. Like I learned it was factor 8. Oh, we're going to call it factor 1 now. Wouldn't work. So we kind of divide it into 2 different pathways, depending on basically how severe the injury is. So extrinsic and intrinsic are our 2 sort of stimuluses that activate the whole clotting pathway. The first one is kind of like the one we've been talking about, the intrinsic. So that's like a pretty mild damage to the blood vessel where you had it. It's not like you got stabbed through the kidney or something. Just a small little break in the blood vessel, so it exposed the collagen, but not deep into the tissue, just kind of a mild one. And you remember that activated platelets on the side, and also factor 12, or XII, is activated by the collagen as well. It combines with calcium to activate factor 10. Factor 10 and 5 come together to make prothrombinase. And then everything after that is what's called the common pathway, which we'll talk about in just a second. And it's common because it's activated by both of these 2. If you get a more severe injury, where you actually get damage to the tissue around the blood vessel, like the lung, the heart, the liver, whatever it is, those cells release something called tissue factor. It's there to very rapidly activate this whole pathway. So it goes right from tissue factor to activating factor X. Combines with V to make prothrombinase, and then it's common after that. So extrinsic, fewer steps. It's a more rapid, faster response to make a blood clot. And then we stop the prothrombinase. Anything with an ACE What does that mean? It's an enzyme. And prothrombinase, it acts on prothrombin. Just tells you in the name what it does. Prothrombin is turned into thrombin by prothrombinase. And then thrombin is actually the enzyme that turns fibrinogen, which is the inactive, like raw materials to make a blood clot, into fibrin. And fibrin's what actually makes the clot itself. Like it's the collagen, well, it's not collagen, it's fibrin, but it's like the little ropes that get tied around the hole. And first it's laid down loose. And after it gets laid down, it kind of automatically shortens all those little ropes you put around the hole. And so as it shortens, it's going to grab more red blood cells, pull everything back together, and create like that strong clot that you would need. So there's a lot of stuff up there. All right, so I just put it in words too, in case you're studying it later. There's extrinsic, there's the intrinsic, and then there's the common pathway. And you can see the picture there. Here's kind of the very beginning where you're just starting to put down fibrin. Fibrin's in yellow. So that enzyme's activating fibrinogen, which turns it into fibrin. And then here's about medium way through. More zoomed in, which is confusing, I think. Or wait, no, that one's more zoomed in. This one's less. So you can see it's kind of thicker fibers even. And then they got completely tight and way more dense by the end of it, to where you can barely even see like the red blood cell behind it. Whereas before, it was like mostly blood cells, a little bit of fibrin, and then once it's complete, you've got the full mesh, fibrin mesh, to prevent the blood cells from leaking out. All right, so I'm going to have you practice with that. Which is number 4, which is, that should be like the compare and contrast one, right?
Yeah.
And as part of that worksheet, I did pass you out a diagram. So you may want to think about like what activates each one, what factors are involved, how fast they are. All right, so we're just doing that one question for now. So it looks like everybody got some good stuff. Here's some questions for you. Can the intrinsic pathway be activated by itself? Like without the extrinsic one activated? It can. Can the extrinsic pathway be activated without the intrinsic? Why not?
Yeah. And extreme damage.
Well, so I'm saying, can the extrinsic pathway be activated by itself without the intrinsic getting activated? The answer is no. Because if you have a severe damage to a blood vessel into the tissue, you're going to have exposed collagen. Yeah, exactly. So when extrinsic's activated, intrinsic is going to be activated too. So you kind of get both pathways, which is also good because then it's even faster than extrinsic by itself.
Is that why it's more rapid?
No, extrinsic itself is more rapid, but if you add in intrinsic, it makes it even better. It's a pretty impressive system when you think about how much, how severe of wounds people can survive with no medical attention even. Like the guy that cut his leg off, right? Or was his arm? Wait.
Arm.
It was his arm, right? He didn't bleed out and die. His blood clotted and,
My
pretty crazy.
sister-in-law met him at a music festival.
Oh, yeah?
Dropping, hey, I'm that guy. Cut my arm off.
I wonder how it's probably a pretty good pickup line, imagine. Like, that movie? That's about me. I'm real tough.
I'm real tough.
It worked on your system. That's funny. It did, didn't it? Yeah, it would. All right. So obviously it's good to be able to clot your blood quickly and rapidly. So if you get an injury, you don't lose all your blood and die. But is there a problem of blood clots causing problems for people?
Yes.
And that would what can that cause? So strokes and what else? So like heart attacks would be the two main problems, and other things too. So there's got to be a good way to turn the system down, turn it off. And the first one is the fibrinolytic system. And this one's interesting because when you're making the clot, when the fibrin's getting put down, it also puts down an enzyme called plasminogen. And after it's in that clot for a while, once the clot's formed, it almost immediately gets turned on to start digesting the fibrin slowly. So it's kind of a mechanism of, we've got the fibrin clot, and that'll be present for, depending on the size of the tear, whatever, 24 hours, 72 hours, whatever. And then you're slowly digesting the fibrin while the tissue's repairing itself. So that when the tissue's repaired, the clot's dissolved, and it doesn't just release from the blood vessel and go float around and cause a heart attack or something. Oh, and I guess this is kind of missing. This should say plasmin dissolves fibrin or breaks it down. I must have just fallen asleep when I was writing that slide or something.
You said plasmin dissolves fibrin?
Plasmin dissolves fibrin, which is what made up the clot in the first place. Anyone in medical terminology? Did you learn this suffix? Something that has GEN at the end? It probably wouldn't. Maybe that's not even in medical terminology. Any idea what this means? So it means an inactive form of a molecule, right? So we've seen two examples already. Plasminogen is inactive plasmin. Fibrinogen is inactive fibrin. So when you see that, it means inactive or so you see that a lot in stuff you read too. All right. So let's try this one. Do I have a copy of this? So 5 is basically, too much clotting, slower clotting, something like that. So once again, use that diagram to help you kind of see where things are happening. All right, so make sure you got the right answers there so we could go on to the next chapter. So if you block thrombin, that means slower clotting. More bleeding, slower clotting. B, I'd probably say that's faster clotting. C, that'd be slower clotting, because that's part of the intrinsic pathway. And D, slower clotting again. And E, it's not that it's slower clotting, but you break down the clot too fast. So maybe you have bleeding problems. Does anyone know anybody with clotting issues? Either too much or too little.
My
Like
wife-
yesterday I had a clotting issue.
Yeah, what, Ross?
My wife has, I think they call it a protein C deficiency, but if she ever takes estrogen-based birth control and becomes pregnant, she'll have to go on like Coumadin and be monitored real closely. And she has to avoid leafy greens.
Huh. So she has too much clotting?
Yeah, too much clotting.
Yeah. I wonder which one. You said C. I wonder where that fits in there. I have to look that
I know
up.
it's called a protein C deficiency. I have not looked
Yeah.
at how that directly applies to clotting.
Yeah, I don't know what protein C is. We'll have to look. We'll have to look into it. But it's something that's pretty common for you to have like too much of one of these factors or not enough or who knows. So what do you think a blood thinner does?
Thins your blood.
I know, that's what you would say. So depending on what you're taking, it could reduce the number of platelets, or maybe it decreases the levels of some of these factors. I mean, there's different kinds of drugs that do that. But it doesn't thin your blood. It doesn't make it more viscous or something. It just makes it not as clotty. It won't clot as fast. I know, well, it's because they call it that, right? Like, of course you would think that. And yeah, another one of my friends had a baby like 6 months ago. She has something, excess clotting. They don't know why or what factor it is. So the whole time she was pregnant, she had to give herself like injections, IP injections. So intraperitoneal, like every day. Because what she took for her blood clotting, like crosses the placenta, so she had to stop taking the actual pill that she was taking. If you do an IP thing, then it goes right into the blood, doesn't really get to the baby as much or at all. So it's kind of crazy. And that's because in pregnancy, it turns up all your clotting factors because you might have a problem. You might need to clot your blood at some point, like if you have a baby, right? Or even during the pregnancy, if something were to tear or slightly go wrong.
Get like varicose, a lot of people get varicose veins and stuff. Just 'cause
Isn't that because your blood pressure is going up?
I have no idea. I just didn't know if it was because of the.
I don't
your
think
veins
so.
I don't know.
You do have more blood, though. Your blood volume, blood pressure goes up, so your veins would be fuller. Which would make sense. But it goes away, though, right? You're talking about the veins showing?
Yeah.
It goes away
Sometimes.
sometimes.
I think it's more genetic.
Maybe. Well, in some places, it could be the skin stretched out, too, depending on what you're talking about, which area. All right. Anyways, what about chapter 20? It's my favorite. What? You want to skip it?
Who needs a heart?
So you said if she gets pregnant or takes birth control, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Control tricks your body into taking it pregnant.
Well, yeah, and it increases. I mean, estrogen increases blood clotting itself, which is why you're not supposed to smoke, right? When you're on birth control too, because that increases blood clotting. Yeah, it even says it on the pills themselves. Isn't that like written on the back? I think I've seen it on there. All right, let's take our quiz then. 20 part 1. All right, so I really thought I was going to trick you with the first one, which is at the bottom of the heart. There's the apex.
That's why I had as much to do on it.
Because it's backwards. Well, I don't know why they call the base if it's at the top. Doesn't make any sense to me. But then again, that's why I put it on there.
Upside down, and it was like the base. And like, I was like,
Not one of the layers of the heart wall. Epa, myo, endo. They all are. Which valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle? Is it mitral, tricuspid, pulmonary, or aortic? It's the mitral valve. And I spelled it wrong, bicuspid, not bicuspic. What about between the right atrium and the right ventricle? Tricuspid. And how about this one? Which of the following holds the tricuspid valves closed? Is it? It's the chorda tendineae. All right, so the heart's a little bit complicated, so you may have noticed. We're going to do some stuff. You'll have it. Because it's really just, if you can start thinking of it as like 4 little pumps. And obviously pumps have to pump blood somewhere, right? So they're all attached to each other or to arteries or veins. So I kind of try to think of it as like a little video, like blood coming in, going through this valve, like following blood cells around. And we'll have a video too of it. But if you can think of it that way, it's a lot easier than think of it as like individual little facts. Like, no, we'll see. All right. So we've got 4 chambers. And the heart is a muscle, so each of those chambers pumps blood somewhere. And one place we can start the cardiac cycle is all the blood that's low oxygen coming from everywhere in your body. It's like your muscles, your brain. It all flows back to the vena cava into the right atrium, which is that first chamber. And then the right atrium pumps into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps into the lungs. And then what does it do at the lungs, the blood? What does it get? It gets oxygen. And then it goes to the left atrium. Left atrium pumps it to the left ventricle. And then the left ventricle pumps it back to all the tissues of your body: brain, muscles, liver, kidney, toes. And then the blood comes back to the right atrium. So that's the simple cardiac cycle without the valves or the arteries or the veins in there. So you kind of see what each of the chambers do. All right, this is, wait, is this the silly video or the real one? Oh, this is the real one. Whoa. Inappropriate. Ross, can you cover your eyes?
Remember the other day?
Oh, with what? With Ross's brothers they're talking about?
No, but they said, no, Ross can be the last one, and he said, oh, that wasn't sexist.
Oh, right. Yeah. Where's our...
The pathway of blood flows through the heart. Oxygen-poor blood from your body returns to the right atrium of the heart. Blood from your upper body returns through the superior vena cava. Blood from the lower body returns through the inferior vena cava. As the right atrium is filled with blood, it contracts, the tricuspid valve opens, and blood is pumped into the right ventricle of your heart. When the right ventricle is full, the tricuspid valve closes to prevent blood from flowing back into the atrium. The right ventricle contracts, pulmonary valve opens, and blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery and to your lungs. The pulmonary valve closes to prevent blood from flowing back into the ventricle.
So why do we need valves? Prevent backflow, everybody's saying it. Because the circulation is all in one direction, through the heart, through the body. It's all has to go one way. But then again, the blood has to get through. So that's why you use something like a valve that only opens that direction, right?
Some people do have problems with like the blood will go back there because valves don't close all the way.
Yeah.
What happens?
We're talking about that later today. But it depends. But I guess we can give one example. So let's say this pulmonary valve doesn't stay closed. So then when this ventricle pumps, most of the blood leaves, but then a bunch of it leaks back in. So now this ventricle is going to have to pump that blood again. Or maybe it has to pump harder to start with. So a lot of times what happens is it has to work harder. So when it gets hypertrophy, and then maybe some of the cells start dying, because you don't want your heart to work extra hard forever.
Atrium is filled with blood. It contracts. The mitral valve opens and blood is pumped into the left ventricle of your heart. This occurs at the same time as the right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle on the other side of the heart. As the left ventricle is full, the mitral valve closes, the aortic valve opens, the left ventricle contracts, and oxygen-rich blood is pumped into the aorta to reach all parts of your body. This happens at the same time as the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary artery on the other side of the heart. The aortic valve quickly closes to prevent blood from flowing back to the heart. Meanwhile, the atria have filled with blood, and the cycle repeats itself.
So you see how the left and the right side of the heart are like doing the same thing at the same time. So you don't want to think of it as like 4 steps. So it's really like 2 steps. So atria contract, and then ventricles contract at the same time. All right, which of the following carries oxygenated blood, or blood with lots of oxygen in it? All right, so it is E. But which ones is it? It is A and B. So everybody said it's aorta, right? From the left ventricle. So the question is these two. So where does the pulmonary artery start and end up? Does it go to the lungs or from the lungs? It goes to the lungs. So is the blood going to the lungs? Have a lot of oxygen in it? No. It doesn't, right? Where does this vein go from? It comes from the lungs to the heart. So it's got high oxygen blood. And of course, everyone has that backwards because what have you learned before? Arteries have good, high oxygen blood and veins have low. Some people have. That's only true of the systemic half, circulation. So everything that goes to the lungs is backwards in terms of oxygen. The vena cava is the veins that go to the right atrium, the main large vein that goes to the right atrium. All right, here's a heart cut in half transversely. And of course, you'll be seeing this. We've got our pig hearts, or is it cow hearts? We've got some kind of animal hearts to dissect. And it actually does look like that. So the right ventricle, the walls are a lot thinner. And look how compared to the left ventricle, the thickness. Why do you think that is? All right, so talk group, and most people chose D, but D is not right. All right, so large shift to B, and B is the right answer. Because they all, like the left and the right side pump at the same time, that means it's going to be the same volume, because whatever amount you pump to the lungs comes back to the left side and you pump it to the body. So you can't have different volumes changing. It always has to be the same. What? Yeah, I guess that would change things a bit. That would be a problem, definitely. And obviously, I mean, how much force do you need to pump blood to the lungs versus everywhere? You need a lot more force. I mean, think about like how much force it must take to pump blood up to your brain. Your brain takes a lot of blood too. Oh, let's do 1 through 3. That's with your little cut up cards. Yes.
So is the mitral valve referred to as bicuspid valve and mitral valve now?
I hear mitral valve more.
See, I've heard that one more than in the book.
I know, the book's always calling it the bicuspid. But yeah, most people call it the mitral valve. So, but I felt like I had to put both. Yeah, it just means it has two cusps.
Yeah.
All right, so you got those cut up cards. You're going to put them in order, starting at the right atrium. Make sure they're not in order if you cut them up. Mix them around a little bit. And try to do this without any notes or anything. Just have to use your brains.
I think so. So then where they go down here with
Well, we already have a left atrium.
I think so. So then where they go down here.